Hello, I'd like to show you a book that is new in the Cooks and Go catalogue. It's here on page 759 and it's called The Art of Soldering for Jewellery Makers, Techniques and Projects. It's by Devenney and it costs £14.99. I would highly recommend that this book is bought because it is a complete compendium of the techniques of soldering. The book is organised into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 talks about getting started in soldering. It tells you about the torches and other tools that you'll need. It'll talk about choosing a metal. It'll talk about solders, the different types of solders and fluxes, what they are and how they're used. It has a very, very useful and necessary section on planning your construction so that you know in advance what sort of soldering techniques you're likely to be using. And then it talks about preparing parts and joins and holding small parts together, which is a very useful thing to know. Talk about that a little bit later. And solder inhibitors, which is also very useful to know about. Chapter 2 tells you all about the key soldering techniques. Now the book goes through so many of them in very, very clear detail. Sweat soldering, butt soldering, soldering jump rings, soldering tubing, multiple solder joints and so on. It then tells you about post-soldering processes, what to do after you've soldered things together, quenching, cooling, cleaning, polishing and finishing, plating and colouring. And then the last chapter is a wonderful chapter on projects. Right, let's get started. The book is very, very clearly set out, very clearly photographed, and very clearly instructed as well. It tells you exactly on this page how to use these pages. So here we have an introduction. And this introduction tells you all about the various types of soldering, soft soldering, hard soldering, a very short amount of information on history, and then a section on soldering today. There's a section on health and safety which is very advisable to read. And there is a design gallery. Now, these projects are all done by master craftsmen and women, and don't be daunted by them. Some of them look very complicated and might have you running for the hills, but don't panic, because once you get into the actual book, everything becomes more within grasp. Here we have getting started. So soldering is a process that's been carried out successfully only when all equipment, materials, steps and procedures have been understood. This photograph is showing a bead that is being held together with binding wire, which is this stuff here. And then we get into talking about torches and the various types, other tools that you might need. And I've just recently discovered soldering wigs, which are these strange looking things here. They're basically wire nests that enable you to get a very even heat around the item that you're soldering. It's also possible to make a soldering wig by using crumpled up lengths of binding wire that you've crumpled up into a sort of nest upon which you place the object that you're trying to solder, so that the heat gets underneath and is distributed evenly around the whole piece of soldering. of silver that you are heating. The tools section is very comprehensive, very well explained and very well illustrated. It talks about choosing metals, solders and fluxes, melting temperatures, how to cut solder strip using a flux cone, a borax cone, setting up a workstation, and preparing parts and joins, preparing your construction. If you know in advance what sort of soldering you're going to be doing, you will know where and when you will need to use soft solder, hard solder, extra easy solder or easy solders. You will know whether you want to sweat solder or butt solder. And then there's the preparation of parts and joins. Using reverse action tweezers, for example, to solder a post onto the back of an earring. So this is holding small parts, and a very useful section on the use of binding wire again. Binding wire is such a very, very useful resource to have. I'd like to move on a little faster to Chapter 2, which are the key soldering techniques. Again, you have here a list of essential tools. And then we start the key techniques. Sweat soldering. Sweat soldering joins two surfaces, one on top of the other. It is practiced often and ideal for seams where solder is difficult to apply, and also for flat-to-flat surfaces such as sheet metal. Step-by-step instructions and extremely clear photography. We then have butt soldering. Soldering jump rings. Soldering tubing. And then a section on multiple solder joints. So if you're going to be heating a joint more than once, for example, it's advisable to start with hard solder and move with every successive firing to a softer grade of solder, so that you don't continuously remelt the first solder you've put on. And then there's this very fascinating idea of using stitches. This is a little shard of metal that is raised that will hold a piece in place while you apply the solder. Very, very useful technique to know. Soldering wire. Quite difficult to do because it's a little bit fiddly. But here the instructions are very clear. Soldering two different types of metal together. Soldering cast pieces. And so it goes on. I'm going to skip now to post-soldering processes. This is chapter 3. So what do you do when your soldering is finished, and how do you clean things up? Quenching, cooling and cleaning, polishing and finishing, hand polishing, and very clear description of all the tools that you might possibly use for cleaning up, including things like thrumming threads that I have to say I have never heard of before. So there is a wealth of information in this book. It really could quite genuinely take your craft, your jewellery making to a different level. Here we have plating and colouring, use of liver of sulphur. We also have a little bit on resin or cold enamelling and oxidation. And chapter 4 is all on projects. Very, very interesting chapter 2 with very innovative projects. And as you will see, each project has its list of essential ingredients and is also rated. So 1 ring means that it's skill level 1. And I think this is going to be my next project after I've finished what I'm working on at the moment, because I really like that. And it tells you here also what techniques are being used. So you know when you start this project that what you're going to be practicing is sweat soldering and soldering on textured surfaces. Also the use of solder inhibitors. This is painting an area of the silver where you don't want solder to go. A very useful thing to know. The projects do get more complicated, but they're always within the realm of possibility. This is a level 2 skill and is teaching butt soldering. And so it goes on, with some projects getting quite complicated. If you're like me and you have only relatively recently started in this craft, just watch the skill level required and ask yourself if you need to know more from other sources, such as a class you might be going to during the week. This, for example, looks to me very complicated. But it may not be broken down into small steps. This is only a 2 skill level. And that's pretty much it. I find this book very inspiring. I do love these projects. I think I'm not going to have any difficulty in my jewellery making class to decide what I might be going to do next. Another very interesting thing. How about this? This is making a pendant using investment plaster. Now, I've never used this technique, but it sounds very well within the amateur jewellery maker's capabilities, and it's definitely one I'm going to want to be trying. Very clearly explained, takes all the mystery out of it. What looks incredibly complicated is broken down into many, many, many smaller steps that are perfectly within the capability of even an amateur jewellery maker like myself. I do hope you found this review interesting. I can highly recommend this book. I'm very glad I've got it. I wish I'd had it earlier. And look forward to doing more book reviews.